Chapter 4. Rory helped walk Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Hooper back to their minibus. He had an arm round Mrs. Collins and could feel her shaking. Miss Leake was leading Mrs. Hooper. Miss Leake was in charge of Golden Year's Home for the Elderly. She told Rory this and a lot of other things that didn't interest him as they walked to the car park. She also kept being cheerful at the old ladies. "Now, don't let's be sillies," she said. "It was just a silly old magic trick, nothing to be scared of. Fancy being scared of ghosties and ghoulies at your age, Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Hooper." "Monster," muttered Mrs. Hooper. "It wasn't a real monster. It was just a young lad, like this lad here," Miss Leake said, waving a hand at Rory. "You're not scared of him now, are you?" Rory thought that Sammy Starr must be at least 15 years older than him. He didn't mention it, though. It was hard to get a word in edgeways when Miss Leake was talking. "Lost," said Mrs. Collins. "So lost." "You're not lost, Mrs. Collins. We're in London." "London," said Mrs. Leake loudly. "Now, you just need to get on the bus and we'll take you home. I said we'll take you back home. Back to lovely Golden Years for a cup of cocoa, then beddy buys." Miss Leake unlocked the minibus, and Rory helped the two ladies up the steps. "Now, I'm going to ask this young man to be very kind," said Miss Leake to her charges. "I'm going to ask him to stay here with you while I go back for the others. I hope they've not got up to mischief while I've been gone." She turned to Rory and gave him a would-be winning smile. "Now, you don't mind waiting, do you? I won't be long. I can't leave my girls alone, though." Rory nodded. "That's fine." "There, do you hear that? He says it's fine. It's fine. You don't have to worry, because he's a nurse," Miss Leake said, with a little giggle in her voice. "Oh, they love a male nurse, do my old dears. Maybe you should be the one to worry." Rory forced a smile onto his face. "I'm sure we'll be okay." Miss Leake went off, still giggling a little to herself. Rory shut the door of the minibus and sat down on a seat. Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Hooper were in the seat behind, and he swivelled round to talk to them. "Are you all right?" he asked. They nodded slowly. The tears had stopped falling now, but both old ladies still looked sad. They had a haunted look, Rory thought, as if they were thinking of a past tragedy. They all sat in silence for a while. The two women were holding hands tightly, clinging to each other for comfort. "What was it, Mrs. Collins?" Rory asked softly after a while. "What's the matter? What scared you?" "Kylie," she said. Rory just gazed at her in surprise. It seemed a very odd thing to be scared of. "Kylie," she repeated. "My name. Call me Kylie, not Mrs. Collins." "Amber," said Mrs. Hooper. "I'm Amber. I'm not mad." "Of course you're not," said Rory. "Who says you are?" "We have to be careful," said Mrs. Hooper. She didn't seem to be talking to Rory. Her eyes were looking far away. "We mustn't tell the truth. They'll think we're mad." "We'll get locked up if we tell the truth," added Mrs. Collins. "Is something bad going on?" Rory asked, worried now. "Is something bad going on at the Golden Year's Home?" To his relief, Mrs. Hooper shook her head. "Not there," she said. "A long time ago, a very long time ago." Mrs. Collins nodded fiercely. "A very long time ago," she agreed. "Today. A very long time ago. Today." Rory had thought he was getting somewhere, but that answer made no sense at all. "It was VE Day," said Mrs. Hooper. "Victory in Europe. I didn't know what that meant then. We didn't do it at school." "They asked me why I was in my nightie," said Mrs. Collins. "Why I was walking around in a daze." Mrs. Hooper almost smiled. "I was dazed too. They said there was a girl like me, a girl who was confused. They wondered if we knew each other. That's how we met. We've stuck together ever since." She squeezed her friend's hand. "They said it must have been a bomb," said Mrs. Collins. "A bomb must have come down and hurt our heads. That's why we didn't know what had happened." Mrs. Hooper nodded. "They said they'd thought the last doodle-bug had fallen months ago. People were upset to think there'd been more bombs. They said it would be the last one, though. There was peace in Europe at last. We knew it wasn't a bomb, but we didn't know what had really happened. So we went along with it." She paused. "We knew there must have been other girls, but we didn't look for them. It's not the sort of thing you can ask people." "They made us join their party," said Mrs. Collins. "It was the biggest party I'd ever seen, right there in Trafalgar Square. They were all so happy. We danced and danced and danced. We were so scared and so lost, but we danced." "I danced with a soldier," said Mrs. Hooper. "His name was Albert. It was a summer's day like this when we got married." Tears began to fall from her eyes again, and she began to sing, "It may be an hour, it may be a week." Mrs. Collins lifted her voice and joined in, "It may be 50 years. Rory felt tears pricking at his eyes too. The two old ladies were so sad, yet so dignified. The moment was broken. The door to the minibus clunked open, and Miss Leake began helping elderly people up the steps. "Everything all right?" she called to Rory, but didn't wait for an answer. "I'm sure you've been fine, even with that cheeky pair. Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Hooper are so naughty sometimes. They do play such jokes. Why, the other day they tried to tell me they were born in 1993. 1893 more like, I said. Didn't I, Mrs. Hooper? But you will have your little joke." She didn't seem to care or even notice that Mrs. Hooper ignored her. When the old people were seated, Rory got up and walked down the bus to the door. "Bye then," he said to Miss Leake. "Goodbye, and thank you so much," she replied, sitting herself down in the driver's seat. "Oh, by the way, you know those friends you were with, that nice red-haired girl and the young man in the plastic bowler hat?" Rory nodded. "Well, they got thrown out of the theatre. Awful, isn't it? So I wouldn't go back there looking for them if I were you." Rory sighed and shut the bus door behind him. Amy and the doctor had been thrown out of yet another place. Luckily, he still had his mobile phone. He kept it with him out of habit. At least in England around his own time it should work. As he moved away from the minibus, he could hear the whole busload of elderly people joining in the song. "It may be an hour, it may be a week, it may be 50 years, but I know we will find loving hearts still entwined on the day we meet again." The wartime song always made him think of Amy. He'd waited nearly 2,000 years for her. 50 years was nothing compared to that. The song told the truth, though. Even after all that time, their love had still been strong. Rory smiled.